Hi, thank you for joining us. My name is David Kumrock. I'm the Director of Communications at the CMT Research Foundation. And thank you for joining us for the Gene Therapies Demystified series. This is the third and final installment in the series. The first session laid the groundwork, what gene therapy is, why CMT is a compelling target, and what the science suggests about its potential. The second session moved from foundational to practical clinical trial design, using the CMT2S gene replacement trial as an example. If you haven't seen either of those, you can still go back and watch. They're both on our YouTube channel, they're both on our website, and we've got links coming up in the chat if you'd like to click on them directly. This final session shifts from the lab to the systems around it, the federal policy landscape that determines how these therapies reach patients. So, why the focus on policy for this closing session? CMTRF aggressively funds a gene therapy portfolio, but none of that science can reach patients effectively if the reimbursement and regulatory systems around them are not ready to move at the same pace. Right now, that landscape is unusually active, with several contributing factors converging all at once. And it's against that backdrop that we bring in today's speaker, John Feore. John is Director of Health Policy and Advocacy for the Institute for Gene Therapies. IGT is a coalition that aligns gene therapy stakeholders, industry, patients, and researchers to advocate for modernized reimbursement and access policy. John will take stock of where things stand with regulation and share how organizations like IGT work alongside patients and advocacy groups to shape policy from the inside. Before I turn it over, first, we've got some exclusive updates on CMTRF and community news to share after the presentation, so we'd appreciate it if you'd stick around to hear those. And also noting this is the last session in the Gene Therapies Demystified series, so we'll also point you toward what's next for the community. Second, John plans to answer questions himself after the presentation, so if you have any questions about federal regulations, you can put those in the Q&A function below. That's in the Zoom client. You put them right there, and then we'll ask after that. With that, John Fiore.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me pull up some slides here. Thank you, Laura and David, for the invitation. Let me make sure that I am on the correct viewing. Is this the correct screen for everyone to see?
Looks good to me.
Okay, excellent. Well, again, I appreciate the invitation. This is an important set of developments and a huge area for innovation and for rare disease patients. It's something that I'm thoroughly enjoying being a part of, whatever little role I can play to help advance coverage, access, and reimbursement. My background is as a healthcare policy and regulatory attorney. I have jumped into consulting since practicing law. I currently sit on the Rare Disease Council in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So without further ado, let me get into the slides here. Let me just figure out, there we go. Okay, so on this webinar, there's a few things I want to briefly touch on. A lot of my slides have more words than I would like on a presentation. But again, this is not a lecture. The slides will be available for anyone who wants to view them afterwards. And really what I want to try and do is provide a brief background on the pipeline of cell and gene therapies broadly and globally in the US, with a focus, of course, on gene therapies here. And then dive into where are we in Washington, D.C., currently sitting in the city right now. It's been a challenging year, but we believe that things are looking up for the gene therapy field and therefore for patient communities and organizations such as CMT. And then I'll explain what IGT is, who we are, who our members are, and what we're doing to advance coverage, access, and reimbursement to gene therapies. And then, as David mentioned, we'll be opening it up for Q&A. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone here. Most of the healthcare dollars spent in this country are on treating chronic diseases as opposed to preventing diseases. In this world of renewed focus on preventive medicine, preventive care, gene therapy fits right into that. So we're really excited that there is a renewed focus on how can we prevent disease before it becomes a lifelong chronic disease. There are a lot of gene therapy, cell therapies that have been approved However, it's been a challenging several years for just the biotech industry, specifically for gene therapies, but the pipeline is still strong. Over 2,000 gene therapies are currently in the clinical trial phase or in development globally, with hundreds of those in the US. We're very excited about that. So, where is Washington? Nothing can be mentioned about Washington, D.C. without talking about an election. It's always an election. The next election is coming up 110 days from today for the midterm elections. Feels like we just had the presidential election. And yes, I've already put 845 days until the presidential election. Congress has, we can say, not arguably, has not done too much. Seemingly, the focus has just been on getting government funding across the board. That's going to continue to be a challenge over the summer and into the fall. What typically happens in an election year is Congress tries to get out of town as early in September as possible after the August recess, so that they can go back in campaign. That's going to be no different this year, and it remains to be seen what healthcare priorities are addressed. So we have about 30 legislative days left in the congressional calendar. One thing that I will note, something that the rare disease community does enjoy, is that our policies, our goals, what we're trying to accomplish, enjoys broad bipartisan support. Rare disease doesn't care how you vote, doesn't care what party you belong to, whether you even vote. Rare disease impacts all communities, all Americans are touched by it in some manner. And so this is something that we're really able to rely on. I think one of the main reasons for that is because of the active patient communities that go before Congress, go before the FDA, go before their members when they're back in the districts, talk to CMS, HHS, all policy stakeholders. That's the focus, is how can I help my child, my parent, or myself? So let's look back a little bit. It's been a rough year for the FDA. There's been a lot of turmoil. None of this should be news to anyone. Turmoil at the leadership, turnover at the leadership, and frankly, a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty in large part for the rare disease community, and that's been a real shame. Goalposts have moved, designs that have been previously discussed and agreed to were changed, but we're hoping that things are starting to turn around. So right now, we have an acting FDA commissioner, Kyle Diamantis. His background is actually in food law, not the medical science that we usually have with an FDA commissioner. The acting commissioner has made it clear he doesn't necessarily want the full-time confirmed role. But what he has done is provide a little bit of stability to FDA. And we're starting to see the ship going forward with interactions with the rare disease community that have been positive. Yesterday, he released a 4 or 5 pillars for how to encourage and enhance U.S. biomedical innovation. Another welcome development for the hopefully new FDA that we'll be seeing going forward and for the rest of the administration. And we look at potential FDA commissioner nominees. I'm not going to go through these individuals, but if you look at their bios and if you know some of those names, they're more traditional folks that have a background in medicine, a background with pharma, with patient groups. So again, positive developments. What have we seen in the last month and a half, maybe? We've seen the FDA come back to the table, meet with rare disease patient advocates, meet with pharmaceutical manufacturers that are in the rare disease space, particularly gene therapy manufacturers. And we've seen what we hope is the turning of the tides, so that when there's a more predictable FDA, particularly with a rare disease therapy, when you don't have millions of patients, when we have a more predictable FDA, we have more predictable funding and investment from those groups, organizations, and investors that are needed, especially at the early stages. The Trump administration, since pretty much the early days of last January, when it comes to health policy, has almost been solely focused on drug pricing. The very first press release from CMS in this Trump 2.0 administration was on drug pricing. It was like two sentences, talked about the IRA drug negotiation window, and that the administration was going to do better than the previous one for negotiating prices. I'm sure everyone's heard about most favored nations, MFN, trying to tie drug prices to foreign prices. There's several models that are out there, voluntary, mandatory, in the proposal stage. Not going to go through the details. I'll note that this globe model would have, it would apply to Part B drugs. So most gene therapies are in that space. But CMS did acknowledge through a request for comment in that proposed rule whether cell and gene therapies should be excluded. IGT and many other organizations submitted comments in opposition to the entire program, but also to note that if CMS moved forward, cell and gene therapies, because of their unique nature, should be excluded from any of these pricing regimes. We're seeing now an increasing challenge with Chinese focus. The Chinese government has really focused in the last 10, 15 years on growing their pharmaceutical innovation ecosystem. And a lot of what the Chinese manufacturers and researchers are doing is looking at the gene therapy space. So this has been an issue that has come up a lot in Congress. It continues to receive and grab headlines in various circles. Whether you're considered a China hawk or America First or protecting U.S. Medical research and funding through NIH, all roads sort of lead to China. And so what we're thinking about as a rare disease community, as gene therapy manufacturers, is how can we encourage policymakers that we need a better, more fluent system in the U.S., a regulatory regime that is able to respond to the rare disease community, rare disease patients more rapidly, quickly, so that we can compete with China, so that we don't lose our spot as the global leader in innovation. A couple weeks ago, I guess about a month ago, HHS announced Operation Trailblazer. This is a response to a lot of the growth and the loss of investment dollars in the US. A lot of manufacturers have pulled out of the gene therapy research space, redirected their assets. So what Operation Trailblazer does or seeks to do is to really break down some of those regulatory barriers to try and speed the process where it can be sped up without, of course, challenging efficacy and safety. So what is IGT, the Institute for Gene Therapies, and what are we doing? We have a corporate advisory council that currently has 7 manufacturers. If you see from the list there, some of them are, the biggest of the big manufacturers. They have advanced therapies, cell and gene therapies, and also day-to-day chronic condition therapies. And then we have organizations that are solely focused in the gene therapy space. Genetics, if you're not aware, used to be Bluebird Bio. They have 3 approved gene therapies. And to highlight or reiterate the point of how challenging this market is, even with those 3 approved therapies, getting them to patients has been a challenge for myriad reasons, and they had to go private and even pull out of Europe because despite approved gene therapies and the amazing science that this represents, there wasn't enough of a market for them. We're most proud of our Patient Advisory Council. The top half of those logos, which includes the CMT Research Foundation, we really rely on our patient advocates and our patient council to help drive what we're doing, the messaging. It's a point of emphasis that IGT has, something that we're really going to step into and lean on in the coming year and years, is to continue to find ways to activate our patient groups, to educate stakeholders and policymakers on the value of gene therapies and what the promise is that this science has. We have a scientific council, some of the most known names as you see there. And also note that some of our patient council members are individuals. And the individuals, often the moms of a patient are really driving the research. The organizations such as CMT are driving the research and partnering with the scientific council members and researchers, universities and schools, and also working with smaller manufacturers that are trying to determine the science, what's going to work. IGT is led by a bipartisan two former members of Congress, Eric Paulson and Donna Christensen. I lead the policy efforts, as David mentioned. My colleague Kenny leads our lobbying efforts, and my colleague Macy does the PR communications. We have a bipartisan lobbying team. The policy is nonpartisan, and our PR communications team is obviously nonpartisan as well. So what we found when we go in front of the Hill, when we go in front of the agencies, is they respect our voice because we're not wading into the politics of certain issues. We're laser focused on gene therapy and advanced therapies and what our patients need. Our broad policy framework, this is one of those slides that I promised not to read, really fivefold. It's important to modernize the current reimbursement regime. Gene therapies do not fit into the world of a daily pill or a monthly infusion. It's a one-time treatment. We hope that they are durable for life. We have no evidence to the contrary, but it's going to take time. And by time, I mean years before we really understand that. But with the innovation, the research, it's costly. We have to be honest with ourselves. Gene therapies cost millions of dollars to manufacture. And even at that price, gene therapy manufacturers are having difficulty staying afloat. We need to alleviate the existing regulatory barriers. A lot of this is looking at different ways to pay for gene therapies. A lot of terms are thrown out there under the umbrella of outcomes-based contracts, value-based contracts, alternative payment arrangements. All of they all have their own acronyms, but they're all working together with the idea of figuring out a better way to pay for this upfront cost while holding payers, whether that's Medicare, Medicaid, commercial payers, employers, holding them harmless if a therapy doesn't work. We're looking for payer flexibility. We're looking for flexibility, for example, as it comes to federal fraud and abuse laws. And I can get into that in more detail as well. One of the things that I'm most proud about from what IGT has done, number 4 there, is to redefine the value narrative. And I'll get into some slides later. This was really an effort that we shepherded through our patient council to make sure that if a value assessment body looked at a gene therapy, they wouldn't come out with an assessment that was so far from reality that we'd be playing defense. And we've really tried to educate stakeholders and the media and those that cover this area, cover pharma and healthcare policy in general, to understand that value doesn't just mean the cost compared to your insurance premium. And then we're looking at what are other obstacles to care. This could be FDA obstacles, could be things like newborn screening. So 4 broad activities that we do. We find champions on the Hill. That's direct lobbying. And we also work with our stakeholders such as CMT and other patient groups. And driving the narrative involves a communication strategy, as I'm sure everyone's aware, to make sure that what is out there is, 1, accurate, and 2, beneficial. So what has IGT done in recent months, recent weeks? In the middle of June, we held a briefing on the Hill that was attended by about 50 individuals, including a bipartisan representation of 4 Senate offices and a Senate committee and 12 House offices to talk about the potential pitfalls and access challenges of most favored nations, or MFN, if it were to be applied to the gene therapy space. It was well attended. It was a great panel. I sat on it. We had patient representatives, a pharmaceutical manufacturer from Orchard Therapeutics that has an approved gene therapy that is now being delivered to patients. It was important to stay in front of Hill staff and policymakers and the media to let them know and keep reminding them what gene therapy might be able to do one day based on what it's already doing today. Chairman Eric Paulson, who leads the IGT, we put an op-ed in Biospace talking about the next FDA commissioner, going back to previous slides on what we hope is a new era for the FDA for today and for the remainder of this administration, is that rare disease has to be a focus of the FDA. The FDA has no problem figuring out approvals, safe approvals of medicines like GLP-1s and chronic medicines to treat, and alleviate symptoms. But the biggest challenges, as I've mentioned, that we've seen over the last 15 months has been in the rare disease space. And this even predates the administration. The FDA itself wasn't necessarily set up for a gene therapy type approval, particularly in the rare space when you don't have as many patients, and a double-blind trial with a placebo may be ethically questionable at best. One of our newest communications methods that we've undertook in the last few months is this Faces of Gene Therapy series, where we're highlighting and telling the story of a patient or a family or an organization that has been directly impacted by a gene therapy. And we talk, and the representative or individual talks about what does it mean to them to have a rare disease, whether they're a patient or a caregiver, and what is the promise that a gene therapy can offer. We send out a weekly newsletter. Anyone can sign up for it. It's not something that's just for our corporate members or the umbrella organizations that make up our patient or scientific councils. And it's just a nice weekly succinct summary of what are the big developments in the gene therapy space. We always include at the end some upcoming events and awareness days. We encourage our patient council members to let us know when there are certain events coming or something that they're interested in. We're always happy to amplify through various social media channels events that you guys are doing. The rising tide raises all ships, and in this gene therapy space, in this rare disease space, we're all working towards the same goal. And frankly, that is to get FDA approved therapies for more than 5% of rare diseases, which is unfortunately where we're at right now. We submit comments to HHS, CMS, FDA, NIH as needed. Some of the annual rulemakings, if anyone's familiar with those, but recent FDA announcements, the plausible mechanism framework. It's very important to stay abreast of what the developments are and to make sure that we're chiming in so that we can help redirect the conversation. We have these policy one-pagers that are up on our website, gene-therapies.org. That are really, kind of like a hill leave behind, if you will. You can pull them down if you want to see. You're more than welcome to use them in any conversations that you might have with policymakers or others. And we really think that it's a great way to distill the various activities that we're doing in a particular subject down to some quick bullet points and summaries. And then finally, I'll end with what I've mentioned several times before, the value of gene therapy. So it was really important for us to make sure that we moved forward from maybe 3 years ago when a gene therapy was approved and most of the coverage was about the cost and how unsustainable that was going to be for the system. And we decided it was imperative that policymakers, the press, stakeholders are aware that value goes beyond a 12-month budget cycle for an insurance plan year. The one cost of a therapy has benefits far beyond that one-time cost or that 1 year. And so what we did was we surveyed our patient members for their input. What's important to you? What's important to your family? What are the things that you would hope a value assessor would look at beyond direct medical costs or even indirect medical costs, so that we can help show the value of gene therapies. And then we came up with these principles. I'll look, number two, one size fits all value assessments are ineffective and discriminatory. It's something that our members were very concerned about. Number three is one of my favorite. The patient, family, and caregiver perspective and preference must be given priority. What we talk about a lot with gene therapies is the transformative potential that they have, and we'll call it the value of hope, and that cannot be discounted. And today's gene therapy approvals and tomorrow's gene therapy approvals will help us learn and help our researchers innovate for the next generation of gene therapies and the next generation. And with every approval and every experience with patients getting gene therapies and seeing the benefits beyond 1 month, 6 months, 24 months, that's just going to help the entire ecosystem to move forward. And with that, David, I'll turn it back to you. I think you're still muted, David.
You're so right. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have some quick announcements here, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. So if you have any questions coming off the presentation, you can put them in the Q&A function below, and we'll get to them. I've got a ton, so I will make sure and promise to do yours first, audience, if you put some in the Q&A box. But first, some key announcements from the CMT Research Foundation. We have a new research project that we funded that's now up on the website. It's in partnership with the 1J Foundation. This one's from University of Miami. It's led by Dr. Stefan Zuckner, and it's targeting a newly identified genetic variant linked to CMT1J. The links for each of these stories is going to pop up in the chat. So if you're looking to learn more, you can always click them through directly there. I won't say that for each story, but the links will be there for each story. The second announcement I have is that we've got a brand new series for scientists. It's called the CMTRF Journal Club. It's a new interactive webinar series built specifically for researchers working in the CMT space. Each session spotlights a recent high-impact publication with a short presentation from the research team, followed by an open discussion and Q&A. Session 1 is going to be July 30th at 11 a.m. Eastern, and it's covering a new paper on a therapy for CMT1A. Again, this series is built for researchers, clinicians, and trainees, so we'd ask that we keep the audience limited there, just so that we can dive into those discussions in depth. Third, the agenda for the 2026 Global CMT Research Convention is live. That's going to be September 24th through the 26th in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thursday and Friday are researcher and industry days, including the keynote from Dr. Anna Greca, founder of the Leaders to Cure Scientific Accelerator. Saturday is actually a full patient-focused day with a clinical trial fair, hands-on stations, and even the dancer motion tracking system you might be familiar with from a previous webinar. You're going to be able to experience that for yourself if you are able to attend the convention. So I'd encourage you to take a look at the convention agenda, see how it appeals to you. And if you're on the fence, if you're thinking, I just don't know if this is right for me at this point, or maybe at this stage in my career, we've got a preview for the convention behind the scenes, and that's going to be our next webinar. It's coming up on August 6th at 7 p.m. Eastern, just like this one. It's also a Thursday night. And if you're interested in the convention and you're unsure if you want to attend, this webinar is built to help you out. It's going to walk through the experience that you can expect and how relevant it is to you. So we'd really encourage you to sign up for that webinar right now. Just to make sure that you don't forget. That's super easy for it to slip your mind. And if you sign up now, then we'll make sure you get the communications you need so that you can log on August 6th and find out if that convention is a match for you and your interests. Finally, if you followed the whole Gene Therapies Demystified series, and especially if you're appreciative of the research progress we're making, we'd encourage you to consider a donation to the foundation. Our highly directed research agenda is supercharged by your support, and that support is super important. So we'd really appreciate it if you consider donating. Again, link in the chat there. And with that, we can move on to the question and answer session. So, John, the first question I wanted to ask you is that you mentioned we spend 85 cents of every healthcare dollar managing chronic illness over a patient's lifetime. Is the idea that a gene therapy's upfront cost is actually going to be cheaper, either now or eventually? Or is it more expensive overall? It's just a matter of shifting how we pay that cost. I'm curious how you see that playing out over time.
Yeah, it's a great question. In some respects, I think it depends on the particular disease and what are the medical costs of essentially a lifetime of managing a disease. Um, but the short answer, in my opinion, is yes. The cost is going to be more than offset by the benefit. We see that, and it may, depending on the number of years, like we've seen with hemophilia, the cost of a gene therapy on just a direct medical expense is like takes like 3 years, and you've got a lifetime of benefit after that. Um, but with pretty much any of the diseases where we're seeing gene therapies in development and whether they're in trials or just in the early research stages right now, um, it's why we created the value narrative, because we have to look beyond just the direct cost, and you have to look at a pediatric patient actually having a full life, and being a contributing member of society. And you look at what we've seen so often, and I'm sure you're so aware in the rare disease community, is you have a kid with a rare disease, and one of the parents has to give up their career to be a full-time caregiver. And from that, then that family's losing income, and challenges remain there. And a lot of times we're seeing, it requires fundraisers, GoFundMe's or whatever to just stay afloat. So and what we've seen in terms of real world evidence, it's limited. Obviously, this is still a pretty nascent technology. But what we have seen from some of our corporate members is their real world evidence is starting to show that the benefits are, financially are far superior with that one-time upfront cost. As the therapies become durable, or I guess remain durable and prove that they can last potentially a lifetime, I think the equation, when we look back, 10 years from now, we're going to say it was a no-brainer.
It's a really thorough answer. Thank you. I did have one follow-up on the economics here, and that is, are there economies of scale with gene therapies? Because they're like bespoke therapies, right? They're for, individuals or very small subsets of the population often. And so does making more of them make them more affordable to produce? Is there a snowball effect that takes place there?
Yeah, there is. And one of the biggest challenges is that right now, there's very few qualified treatment centers for each gene therapy. So we have the end goal is that whatever community you live in, you should have access to a gene therapy. And right now, I mean, we're probably at like 10% of the country has access to any type of advanced therapy, whether it's a cell therapy, a CAR T, or whatever. By expanding where people can get gene therapies and by getting more of them into patients, we learn each time, right? Whether it's the initial apheresis to collect the blood, we're getting better on each step of the way. But we need to continue to have more therapies approved, more therapies delivered, so that the economies of scale can figure themselves out. The delivery of them, and the process can take up to a year for some of these therapies, when you talk about what's needed for the patient. But the answer is yes, we need more therapies to be delivered in more settings, in more geographic locations, because we're all learning, we're sort of all working together. We all are learning more. And as we get more therapies, then manufacturers and the other players involved in the delivery are going to figure out where can there be greater efficiencies. And so that's going to take time as well. But it will lead to a system where they can have a lower cost.
Got it. That's helpful. So one other thing I wanted to ask you about in the regulatory sphere is we talked a little bit about the Chinese innovation that's happening in the gene therapy space. But we've seen, like, for example, similar innovations in electric vehicles, but those vehicles aren't allowed access to American markets. Do we have any indications of which way regulations would lean if the next big gene therapy breakthrough were to come from China?
Yeah, I think there are definitely some China hawks in DC that essentially want to put up a wall and not allow any of the research learning from China to get over to the US. Frankly, that is not my preferred solution. My preferred solution is if there's some research breakthroughs, that we try to work with whatever companies are reaching those breakthroughs to bring them to the U.S. And that as U.S. policymakers, we look to why is innovation moving into China and out of the US, and how can we solve that from the US side? The solution isn't to put up walls, it's to break them down in the US so there isn't that desire, financially or otherwise, to go outside the US.
That makes sense. When we're talking about lessons learned, we just had that conversation about learning lessons from China, but I am curious. The FDA released some draft guidance a few weeks, maybe a month ago, and it was aimed at sharing lessons from trial to trial within the US, right? Do you make anything of that? Is the draft guidance too early in its iteration to draw conclusions, or do you feel like that telegraphs a direction that the FDA might be leaning?
I think it's a positive direction, to my point of the next year feels like it's going to be better. To the extent that innovators and researchers are able to collaborate, it feels like if we have like a hub and spoke model, that's probably preferable, certainly in these early days. And where we can avoid duplication of efforts, and putting up walls in between different research, obviously protecting IP and the researchers themselves, but where we are able to talk to each other, I think we need to promote that. Because I can tell you, like, a manufacturer doesn't want to charge $5 million for a therapy. If they could produce it for a fraction of that cost, they would be more than happy to. And that would be better for payer budgets. Again, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, or commercial or employer. If we're able to reduce the costs through regulatory changes, through increased volume and access, to better communication and collaboration, I think that's what we need to encourage.
Absolutely. You went through a lot of changes in the FDA leadership tonight. Practically speaking, does that slow things down for therapies that are already in the pipeline, or is that happening kind of on parallel tracks? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think there's been a little bit of a slowdown. That being said, I think what will happen is we'll see a subsequent acceleration in approvals. Approvals that are warranted, obviously. So I wouldn't say there's like a backlog, where we just need to then push it through. But I believe that we've seen a lot fewer rare disease therapies approved, in the first 6 months of this year than I think the first 6 months of last year. But that being said, the pipeline is still strong. The recent announcements from FDA to bring back some meetings, and for manufacturers to resubmit applications, I think that's a good sign. And so, there may be a little gap, where we're looking at, there's a change in leadership. There's obviously going to be some disruption. But when we start to then move forward and think ahead 8 months, I believe it's going to look a lot better, at this time next year.
That's encouraging. I am curious, is there any perceived tug of war between the political appointees in these roles and the scientific leaders that are doing their jobs as normal? We've seen that play out even in other areas of government research funding. I'm curious how you see that in the FDA. Do they seem aligned or do they seem at odds?
Yeah, I think we certainly can't hide behind what all of us have seen in the press, over the last year, and a lot of back and forth. I think that right now the FDA is in a good spot. They've been talking about the need for hiring more scientists and trying to advance their internal, whether it's using AI to help with reviews. I hope that the interplay and interactions between the political and career staff are trending positive. By all reports, that is what we're seeing. Wouldn't be surprising if there's some skepticism from career staff, based on what's happened in the past. But I do feel that we've got a brighter picture where both sides of, whether you're political or career staff, recognize that the rare disease community needs a fully functioning FDA, one that's working with the community, that's working with innovators and manufacturers and researchers to try and move therapies forward and get to a better spot for rare disease patients.
Thanks. I have another question here from the Q&A, but it's a little more in depth, so I'm going to read it to you word for word to make
Mhm.
sure that I represent it correctly. As a researcher working on CMT, again, the question answer, not me. As a researcher working on CMT, I'm interested in how disease severity should shape the development and societal acceptance of gene therapies. CMT is generally not life-threatening, but severity varies greatly among individuals and over time. Given the potentially durable effects and uncertain long-term risks of gene therapy, how should we approach the risk-benefit balance for diseases with such a broad severity spectrum?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I don't know that I have a great answer for it. Um, it Frankly, a rare disease is a rare disease, and whether it's severe, progressive, debilitating, or something that can be managed, more easily on a day-to-day or month-to-month basis, I would hope that whatever trials are approved by the FDA, they recognize, if something is more severe, there's a little more flexibility to design the trials. Um, the goal is getting safe and effective medicines to patients. It doesn't help anyone to push through a gene therapy or any therapy for that matter and then have it fail because that would just set back everyone. Not just CMT research, but all disease states that are in the gene therapy field. So, for me, a bespoke system, but one that isn't, bespoke in terms of how it takes so long to figure out for each therapy. I also believe that as we get more therapies approved and have more real world evidence, we'll start to find the different variations and maybe genetic mutations that are assigned with to various diseases that we're going to find certain tracks work better with those compared to others and then haven't even gotten into like delivery mechanisms and that scientific aspect of it. But my hope is that we're flexible enough to address diseases and that we don't get to a point where we need to prioritize one severity over another because we have promising research in all areas.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I appreciate your insight there. So IGT works with a lot of patient advocates and doctors. How do you decide which policy fights to prioritize when there are so many happening at once?
Yeah, that's tough. We've been fortunate enough to, and I don't say stay in our lane in a bad way, but when we created IGT a little over 6 years ago, 6.5 years ago, the idea was to stay focused on this particular area of advanced therapies. And most of advanced therapies in general kind of fit within this category, where we've largely been able to stay out of larger pharma fights, big pharma versus here, insurance plans and hospitals, things like that. Because I think it gets to my point early in the presentation about rare disease doesn't care who you are or what you look like. Um, and everyone is just a couple connections at most away from a rare disease patient. And so our focus areas, coverage, access, reimbursement, and that covers a lot, obviously, is enabled us to have credibility on the Hill and with the executive branch because we're not chiming in on something that perhaps we don't need to or shouldn't. And frankly, we have communications with our corporate council members and our patient advocates on certain questions. Is this something we should weigh in on? And sometimes the answer is no. And the reason for that, there can be multiple reasons, but sometimes the reason is this is a little out of our lane and we don't want to harm our credibility.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a really tough task of discernment there. I've got another one from the audience here. What can an individual, a U.S. citizen, do to encourage better government interaction with, say, your organization, right? So, what can we do to encourage our government to be more open to engagement with organizations that are advocating for these kinds of outcomes?
Yeah, a lot of times it's just in a call or an email to your members of Congress. Everyone has two senators and one representative. What we found when we do these Hill briefings, and we've done a bunch of them, years ago, it was really, what is gene therapy? It was very new. And when IGT was first formed, news articles were about, creating a baby with blonde hair and two different colored eyes or something. It was weird science fiction. But now what we found is that when we have discussions with policymakers about gene therapy, never once have they walked away like, eh. I mean, it's really exciting stuff. And every conversation with a staff, whether it's a staffer or an intern at a congressional office, to the members themselves, they're always able to tie it to something, someone they know, someone they interacted with, a brother, a sister, mother, a child. They're able to tie it into something important to their lives, because rare disease affects so many people. And we've now found that when we do the Hill briefings, we're getting questions that aren't, what is this? We're getting questions like, do you need more funding? Does the Medicare reimbursement need to be changed? I mean, they're asking questions which are implying that they're looking for solutions and looking to help. And so that's been a multi-year process to gain that trust, and to educate. And every election I mentioned, we have the midterms in a few months. In January, we're going to have about a third of the Congress is going to be new. That pretty much happens every time. That means there's going to be new members on the committees that are in charge of healthcare policy. There's going to be new staff in town working for these members. And so every time there's a new Congress, so every other January, there's new individuals and members that are looking to learn and want to learn. And it provides us and our members and organizations like CMT a great opportunity to go and meet the new people in town and explain what your organization is. And one of the things we found, because this is not some, it's not like a military spending thing or, immigration or, single payer. I mean, it's really focused on rare disease patients and how can we, as the collective United States, help get better access to treatments for rare disease patients. It's an area that most members of Congress, most policymakers can get behind.
Right. That makes sense. So I've got kind of two questions in the same vein here. So for families watching tonight who want to help with advocacy work you describe, what's the easiest first step? What's the first thing that you do to see like, oh, is this a realm where I want to be involved? Obviously, the research ecosystem is complicated. There's a ton of ways to contribute. So what would you say is the easiest one in policy to get you involved?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think it's getting in touch with, folks are here for a reason today, CMT research. When what we found with parents and future patient advocates, or existing patient advocates, is it started with them just researching, what is this disease that I've never heard of that my child now has, or I've just been diagnosed with, and they start diving into it. The best thing to do is go to the organization that's representing that disease and reach out and say, how can I get involved? Because that can be a hill fly-in where you meet members of Congress and the staff. It can be signing on to letters. IGT does that when there are letters that, if there's a proposed rule or if there's something coming down in the policy world that we feel is important to comment on, we'll reach out to the patient groups and say, hey, let's do a sign-on letter and get our voices heard. And often what we found in the rare disease space is that the parents, especially, they do the research and there isn't an organization for that rare disease. So they go on Facebook and lo and behold, there's hundreds of other or dozens of other families that have the same thing. And what do? They create that organization. And organically, the patient, I mean, I feel like all these patient groups have started organically out of a need because there wasn't someone doing it then. And so we really rely on our patient groups as IGT to help drive the conversation. And it's great for me or someone representing a manufacturer to go before the Hill and explain the science or explain the, intricacies of Medicare reimbursement and Medicaid, et cetera, et cetera. But having a rare disease patient or a rare disease parent is 1,000 times more effective.
Hey, so the few instances where I've worked on campaigns that have kind of reached the Hill, one of the things that I was always most surprised by advocates is that they would tell me that the folks who are often most effective in reaching legislators are everyday citizens with a story to tell. Has that been your experience too? It certainly seems that that's the implication of what you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Members of Congress and their staff have dozens of meetings every day that they're in town. They all follow along the same general format. You have about 15, 30 minutes, explain who you are, what you're doing, and why you're here, and what are you asking for. When they meet patients with these incredible stories and their families, that resonates and it really sticks with individuals compared to, oh, we've got this tax code issue that's harming, our business expensing. Things like that aren't exciting, and I'm not trying to demean anyone who's in that space. Meeting a rare disease family is far more impactful, and that's really what they remember.
And I find that such an optimistic view of government too, that it really does play out in real life that the folks who are just everyday citizens with a story to tell can really make a difference in that way. And I've always been so impressed to see that happen, from the start of my career until now. I do have one more kind of specific question about the gene therapy landscape that I want to ask before kind of a broad question to wrap us up. Is the focus on getting gene therapies for children, or are middle-aged adults included in that landscape too? Do regulators differentiate? How do they differentiate? How do they prioritize?
It really, I think the research and the trials dictate that answer, frankly. If you asked anyone that had to say, they'd probably say, well, we have to do the children first. But to be honest, these therapies, the sort of once you get the trial design, we saw this with DMD. You get an approval for a certain age, and then you're trying to expand that approval as quickly and as safely as you can. So it really is up to the trial design. There's not a bias to say, well, if there's these two therapies, we're gonna do the children first and then go to the 40-year-olds. It really does depend on where we're going. For us as IGT, when we're talking to policymakers, that's one of the things we talk about is the gene therapy field. Rare disease patients can literally start at birth through the Medicare age. It doesn't matter. Rare disease doesn't pick or choose what age you get it. And every time we have a success of a gene therapy, to be specific to our field, every time that there's a success, that's good for the next ones, whether it's a pediatric, middle-aged, or a senior age.
Awesome. So to wrap us up, I want to ask kind of an overarching question. Between everything you covered, the FDA, Congress, drug pricing models, what are you most optimistic about? What gives you the most hope looking to the future when it comes to gene therapies?
Yeah, the thing I'm most excited about is just more therapies approved, because I truly believe that when you get one therapy approved for a particular rare disease, it's the follow-on indications, the follow-on research that can really expand it out to other diseases, other variants of that disease, and to a larger number of patients. And so for me, the science is, it's science fiction is now science. And we're getting to a place where I believe that with each approval is going to just really give momentum to other researchers and other manufacturers, because we've been in a pretty a down economy in terms of investment in gene therapies, and so we really just need more therapies approved, regardless of where they are, to get people more comfortable because every time there's an approval, it's another opportunity for organizations like yours and mine to educate policymakers and to be excited about what has just happened and the patients. And so it really is, let's keep pushing forward, but we need successes in order to push forward.
I think that's such a nice message to wrap up on because I think what it drives home to me is that while there are certainly opportunities in policy to pave the way to make this road easier, the real excitement is in the science. We're achieving so much right now. The world is changing so quickly, and the CMT Research Foundation is doing our very best to stay on the cutting edge of that for Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease. And I think there's a lot of hope on the horizon. It's a really exciting time. And so I want to say thank you, John, for joining us. This was a really thoughtful conversation. I think it was really informative for our audience. It was certainly informative for me. And I want to say thank you to the audience for joining and participating, especially contributing your questions. It's been really enlightening, and we really appreciate your enthusiasm in the research as well. We look forward to continuing to work to deliver more treatments and cures for Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone.